above the thing that's being exposed, in this case, like us, right? Okay, so ionization events occurring above the surface of the object. That's what exposure is. We get from this measuring exposure, we can infer something called entrance skin exposure. However much radiation we measure about to interact with the body, we can roughly speaking infer that all of that ends up interacting with the body. Whatever we measure enters the body. Now, it doesn't all absorb in the body, right? Because we learned like gamma and X-rays, 10% of gamma rays are going to pass right through the body, right? So what actually gets absorbed by the body is some fraction of what you're exposed to, okay? For X-rays, 1 or 2 or so percent, a couple percent points, exit the body. So you're exposed to you absorb almost as much as you're exposed to, right? Alpha particles, do they penetrate? No, right? So for alpha radiation, whatever we measure as far as the exposure, you're going to be absorbing basically all of it, right? Because they don't penetrate through the body. So go ahead.
When you say absorb, what do you mean?
I mean stay inside the body.
Okay.
Yeah. Not pass through, in other words,
Okay.
right? So there's a relationship between entrance skin exposure or exposure and how much the body will absorb, okay? We're not to the absorption part of the story yet. Right now, we're just talking about how much are we exposed to. That's called exposure or entrance skin exposure.
And that's still part of radiation exposure?
That is exposure. Entrance skin exposure is exposure. Okay. The way to talk about exposure is it actually shares units with talking about electrical charge. Okay, so we'll learn in one of our modules that we go through. We learn all about electricity and electrodynamics. Electricity can be measured in a unit called coulomb, and I'll put it up here in a second. Right here, coulomb. A coulomb is an amount of electric charge. When an ionization event, when something ionizing happens above the surface of the body, the way it's detected is a little detection chamber. When it gets hit by radiation, a small amount of electricity gets generated, okay? So like let's turn on my Geiger counter here. Bear with me. So if you're really quiet, can you hear it? Mm-hmm. Clicking, right? What's happening here is I've counted six emissions so far, just being in the room, right? This is our background radiation it's measuring. Every time it clicks, right, that's telling us that inside the detection chamber inside of here, little compressed air detection chamber, some radioactive particle is having a decay event, okay? That alpha, beta, or gamma emission is hitting the molecules of air inside of the detector and generating a small amount of electric charge, okay? That electric charge is read by the computer in here, and the computer knows to make a clicking sound through the little speaker every time that happens, okay? Because we measure ionization events, those ionization events create a small amount of electric charge. We talk about exposure in units of electric charge, okay? Coulombs of electric charge per kilogram of body tissue, per kilogram of matter. So the unit for exposure is coulomb per kilogram. Coulomb is an amount of electric charge. Kilogram is an amount of mass. If you've been with me for a while, we've talked about electricity and electrodynamics, electricity flowing, and we learned about the amp as a unit of electric current. It's the same number here. 1 coulomb of charge is about a billion ionizations happening. 1 billion billion, so a billion billion, not 2 billion, but a billion billions, right? Number of ionization events. That's all you need to know is that a Coulomb per kilogram is the unit of electric charge we use to measure exposure
In the air.
in the air above the object. Yep. Okay, so Coulomb per kilogram is our unit for exposure.
So unit for exposure is going to be the Coulomb,
Coulomb per kilogram.
and then dose would be something else.
Dose is going to be, we're going to get to it,
But
right?
it will be like a different.
It's going to be a different unit, yep.
So they all have different units.
Yes, well, yes and no.
Yes and no.
Okay, so let's talk about dose. Let me turn my little Geiger counter off. I'll bring the Geiger counter back later for a different thing. All right, so whatever you're exposed to, some of it, if it's X-rays or gamma, but some of it can pass through the body, okay? So you aren't absorbing 100% of what you're exposed to, right? You absorb some percentage of what you're exposed to. Since some X-rays penetrate through the body without interacting with the atoms, we cannot base absorbed dose and further biologic damage on exposure. They say, like a dose of medicine is internalized by the body, a dose of radiation is internalized energy, right? The doctor gives you a dose of medication. Does your body use 100% of that? No, right? You take 1,000 milligrams of Tylenol and you're not getting 1,000 milligrams of Tylenol acting on your body. You're getting some fraction of that, okay? The Tylenol that you took, the 1,000 milligrams, is like the exposure, right? The absorbed dose is whatever actually works for your body, right? You take Tylenol and your liver is going to be, this is why the Tylenol is hepatotoxic, right? It's bad for the liver, right? Because your liver's acting to detoxify the medication, and get it out of your, work it out of your body while it's trying to do its job, right? And so if you take too much of it, it can damage the liver. In any case, the amount of medication you take is like what you're exposed to. However much acts on the body is what is like the absorbed dose. Okay. The unit for measuring the concentration of energy actually deposited into the body, and should be no surprise by now because we've been using it for the entire last class, is the gray. We're going to see another unit of energy here, another unit of, so the Coulomb per kilogram is a unit of electric charge. If you just want to talk about energy, the way to do that is by using a unit called joules, Joules, joules. Joules is a unit of energy that can be converted between electrical, mechanical, potential energy. We can use the unit of joules to talk about any kind of energy. In this case, just to give you the definition of a gray, 1 gray is a joule of energy deposited per kilogram of body tissue. So if you weighed 1 kilogram and you got 1 joule worth of energy from radiation, you got 1 gray's worth of radiation. Yes?
That was one of the truths. So when I looked it up, it said that, but then it had a little -1 on top of the kg. Does that make a difference?
Potentially, so like an exponent of -1
So it says that J
joule
kg
per kilogram.
with a little -1 on top of the kg.
It's like in the superscript up here where the laser pointer's at.
Does that make a difference?
It would make a difference, but that would be wrong, I think. So I'd have to see what you wrote. what you have, so I can help with that. Okay, one gray is a joule of energy per kilogram of tissue. The gray is the primary unit we're going to use to talk about absorbed dose. And interestingly, we also use the gray in place for exposure too. I know I just gave you the Coulomb per kilogram, but the gray is also used to talk about exposure, okay? We just denote, if we're talking about the air above the body, gray subscript A, so GY with a little a, right, air, or gray subscript T, denoting energy absorbed in tissue. So the gray is appropriate to be used for exposure as well as absorbed dose. Okay, so the next thing I want to say is if you're exposed to 1 gray of radiation in the air, you will not receive an absorbed dose of 1 gray, okay? Because some radiation penetrates through the body, absorbed dose is slightly less than surface exposure. Roughly speaking, 1 gray of exposure, also known as air kerma, 1 gray of air kerma is about 0.96 gray of tissue dose. Roughly, you absorb 96% of what you're exposed to. However, you can approximate 1 gray of exposure is roughly 1 gray of tissue dose, because they're almost the same, right? 96% of something is almost the whole thing, right? So if this is saying that, in this case, about 4% of the radiation passed through the body, right, didn't get absorbed by the body, for all intents and purposes, to simplify things, we can say that 1 gray of exposure equals 1 gray of absorbed dose, even though they are actually a little bit different. But we like to make things simple for ourselves. For that reason, we can often informally interchange exposure and absorbed dose, right? I can say you got exposed to 1 gray, or you got 1 gray of absorbed dose, and you know I mean roughly the same thing, because they almost are the same thing. It's just measured differently.
X-ray and gamma?
Yeah, X-ray and gamma would be the examples, good examples for this. But this can also work for alpha and beta too. Alpha, beta, gamma, and X-ray all cause ionizations. And so just by just measuring how many ionization events are happening, getting the absorbed dose or the exposure, you can't infer which kind of radiation it is. This is just telling you, so this is why this is important, absorbed dose is important. It's just telling you how much you got, okay? It's not telling you anything about how harmful that is, okay? 1 gray of exposure to alpha radiation is not the same as 1 gray of exposure to X radiation, okay, X-rays, okay? One of them will be more harmful for the body. And I bet you know which one it is by now. Alpha, right? Alpha is going to be more harmful. We'll quantify in a moment here how much more harmful it is, but right now all we can say with understanding exposure and absorbed dose is all we can say is how much radiation you were exposed to and how much of that did you actually absorb, okay? And for all intents and purposes, you absorb as much as you're exposed to. You're exposed to 1 gray, you absorb 1 gray. And then with the in parentheses going, well, they're not exactly, it's not exact, right? But for all intents and purposes, we're approximating them to be the same. So this in yellow, I think, is the most important thing on this slide here. 1 gray of air kerma, or exposure, is approximately 1 gray of tissue dose. All right, so we use the unit, the gray. And you know, for perspective, last class we did perspective, right? So 1 gray to the whole body is potentially fatal, right? Not guaranteed, but potentially, right? So we have like a way to talk about like what's harmful, what's not, right? Above 1 gray, we're talking possibility of death. Below 1 gray, that's not likely to happen. Bad things still happen, but it's not likely, you're not likely to die. Okay. Again, absorbed dose and exposure just tell you how much. Okay, it doesn't tell you what you were exposed to and how and what that actually means as far as what's going to happen to you. Okay, harm, in other words. To understand harm, you have to now talk about what type of radiation you're exposed to. So we have our next unit called the dose equivalent.
What about radiation? Did we just do radiation dose?
We did absorbed dose, radiation dose, yeah. So we did exposure and dose.
Okay.
An exposure tells you how much you're exposed to, dose tells you how much you absorbed,
Okay.
and we just said the most important thing from that section is they're almost equal.
Yes.
And we get to talk about them like they're equal, okay? Give you 1 gray exposure, that's 1 gray of absorbed dose. Okay, so the gray that we've been using is technically a physics unit. It's telling you how much of something, right? It's a quantitative, right? It's not telling you anything about biologic harm. Until you know what type of radiation you're using, we can't infer an amount of harm. Once we know how much and what kind, it's we have a new unit to talk about now. It's called the sievert. Capital S, little v, sievert. That might not have carried over. Interesting. Yeah, it goes straight from. So if at the bottom of the page dose equivalent, it goes straight from one to the other. I see that. But dose equivalent is what we're talking about right now. So just add in the unit sievert there if you're following with the notes. That's something I'll have to address. Okay. All right. It's not as hard as it might seem. If you know how much you're exposed to, then you know how much you absorbed, right? If you know how much you absorbed and you know what kind of radiation it is, you can apply the radiation weighting factor, which is just a number. Multiply the absorbed dose by the number, and you get the dose in sieverts. So let me read this, then I'll explain, and then I'll write a couple things on the board. Hang in there. The radiation weighting factor, which is noted as a capital W, subscript lowercase r, W sub r, is comparing the relative harmfulness of the type of radiation you're talking about compared to X-rays. So we're saying compared to X-rays, how much more harmful is this type of radiation? And we're going to get a number, how many times more harmful it is. So, for example, alpha particles. Alpha particles have a radiation weighting factor of 20. So when compared to that's interesting. A little synchronous coughing. When compared to X-rays, alpha particles are 20 times more harmful. Okay, so I give you 1 gray of alpha radiation, 1 gray of X-rays. Okay, they look the same. So let's say your absorbed dose is 1 gray of alpha, and another person gets 1 gray of X-rays. Okay. Alpha has a radiation weighting factor of 20. X-rays is 1. Okay? So to get this, you take the unit in gray, multiply it by whatever that number is, radiation weighting factor, and you get the answer in sieverts. Okay? So let's do it for alpha particles. How many grays of radiation? 1. What's the radiation weighting factor for alpha?
20.
Times 20 equals 20 sieverts. Okay? How many?
1.
1 gray of X-rays? Radiation weighting factor? 1.
Is 1.
1 sievert. Okay? So dose equivalent tells you alpha particles are much more harmful. 20 times more harmful, right? If I gave these two people equal amounts, 1 gray for each, right? And you get, Christina gets 1 gray of alpha radiation, and Hortensia gets 1 gray of X radiation. Who's more likely to survive? Yeah, Hortensia, right? Because she got X-rays versus Christina getting all alpha rays, all alpha particles, right? And we just learned that alpha particles cause 20 times more biologic harm when compared to X-rays, okay? Here's the important takeaway from this. This is the most important thing, because like learning these numbers, great. You should know these numbers, commit them to memory the best you can, the radiation weighting factors for each. So, okay, I'll get to the most important note in a second here. But look, X-rays have a radiation weighting factor of 1. That's saying that X-rays are as harmful as X-rays. They're no more harmful than they are, right? They're as harmful as themselves. Beta radiation, its radiation weighting factor is 1, so it's roughly as harmful as X-rays are. Fast neutrons, between 5 and 20, averaging about 10, and alpha particles at 20. All right, this next thing. This is the most important thing about dose equivalent. Because the radiation weighting factor for X-rays is 1, the relationship between exposure, dose, and dose equivalent can be very simplified, right? You're exposed to 1 gray of radiation. That equates to 1 gray of tissue dose, which comes out to 1 sievert in dose equivalent. They're equal, okay, with X-rays. As long as, and that's the field we're in, right? We're talking about X-rays. So for X-rays, exposure, dose, and dose equivalent are all the same as far as what they come out to measure. So again, I give you 1 gray of exposure, you absorb about 1 gray. And it has about 1 gray's worth, or 1 sievert worth of biologic harm. So for that reason, the gray and the sievert are basically interchangeable for X-rays. So then we got to ask, when do we use gray? When do we use sievert? Okay, and the simple answer is, which I'll restate later. The simple answer is we use gray when we're talking about our patient's exposure and absorbed dose. We use the sievert when we're talking about occupational dose equivalent. So we just use 1 for our patients and 1 for workers. We don't get exposed on purpose, right? We do expose our patients on purpose, okay? So we call their radiation a dose because we're giving it to them on purpose. Ours referred to as dose equivalent. So we use the sievert for ourselves, the gray for our patients. Yeah, so the sievert dose equivalent is used for people for workers, right? Occupational workers. SV for workers, and gray for our patients. In other words, we use dose for our patients.
And then we get the exposure.
Exposure and dose are almost interchangeable. So remember, your dose and exposure, even though they mean different things, they're a 1-to-1 relationship. So right.
They get 1, we get 1.
Right. So there's a 1-to-1 relationship, right, for exposure, for dose, and for dose equivalent. There's just a 1-to-1 relationship for all 3 of those things for X-rays. Okay. There is one further complication, because that covers exposure. We use gray subscript A. Absorbed dose, gray subscript T. Dose equivalent, we use the sievert. So we need to discuss next effective dose. All right. Exposure, dose, and dose equivalent. We've said how much the air got above you, exposure, how much absorbed in you, absorbed dose, and what kind of radiation was it, dose equivalent. Okay? As long as it's X-rays, those three things are equal. Okay? If it's any other type of radiation, those three things will not be equal. Good news is, we're in an X-ray technician program, right? So we're talking about X-rays. Almost everything we have to remember deals with X-rays. So one-to-one relationship, that makes it easy for us. The last thing is learning that all tissues in the body are not created equal. Okay? Certain tissues are more susceptible to harm from radiation than other tissues. So you add in what's called the tissue weighting factor, and you get something called the effective dose. So the tissue weighting factor provides a measure of radiosensitivity of a particular tissue or organ when compared to other tissues. So you can take the absorbed dose, multiply by a tissue weighting factor, which will be some numbers here in a second, and you can come up with something called the effective dose. And let me be clear, all this is telling you is it's more harmful on certain areas of the body than others. Exposure to the gonads, more harmful than exposure to the nervous system, right? The brain. So the tissue weighting factor is only really useful when you can compare tissues. Okay, so if you just have one tissue to talk about, it's less useful. It's only really useful for comparing tissues. We don't use this one often. Really, we stop at dose equivalent, but this one still needs to be, talked about. So again, take the dose, the absorbed dose in gray, multiply by some tissue weighting factor, and it's still going to give you sievert as the unit. So here's your tissue weighting factors. You have them on the bottom of the front page of the notes section. 0.01 for skin, 0.05 for organs, general organs, 0.12 for bone marrow, 0.05 for breast, and 0.2 for gonads. The bigger this number is, the more sensitive to radiation that part of the body is, with gonads being our most sensitive. You do not have to memorize tissue weighting factors. You must remember the radiation weighting factors. So effective dose, while useful to know about, it's telling you how harmful things are to individual body tissues. You must remember these top three: exposure, absorbed dose, dose equivalent, and the units used. Hang on, this one's good, right? Hang on to it, but if you're going to forget anything, that's the one. Well, forgetting means you remembered it to start with. So if you're just not going to start by memorizing something, effective dose is the one to forget. But it's there. Tissues are different. We'll talk about in upcoming modules exactly how and why these tissues are different from each other. Right now we're just stating, yep, they're different and they have different sensitivities to radiation. Okay, so let's round out what we just said and move on to the next section. So proper use of these units, Coulomb per kilogram for exposure, it's a physics unit. It's appropriate for describing the intensity of the X-ray beam as it leaves the X-ray tube. So if you're a radiation physicist measuring X-ray equipment, right, you're probably going to use Coulomb per kilogram to measure ionization as the X-ray beam exits the tube, making sure the equipment's working right. The gray is also a physics unit. It can describe what we call air kerma or tissue kerma, otherwise known as absorbed dose. And so it's good for telling you how much radiation stuck around in your body. Okay? The sieverts, for dose equivalent or effective dose, help us learn and understand an amount of biologic harm, such as alpha rays cause more biologic harm than X-rays. Or the gonads are more sensitive than the breasts, right? Okay. Gray and sievert are going to be your most important things. Now, these are big units, right? I told you 1 gray to the whole body is enough to cause death, right? So we don't regularly or ever receive or are exposed to a full gray worth of radiation, right? We are exposed to milligray per year, right? Or microgray per time, per exposure period, right? So we need to use smaller units, okay? The more common for gray and sievert is the microgray or microsievert. Micro means 1/1,000,000th. So 1 microgray is 1/1,000,000th of a gray. A microsievert, 1/1,000,000th of a sievert. Medicine, since 2018, medicine including radiography, has switched over to the metric system. However, the personnel monitoring companies, these badge companies that send us our radiation detection badges, they're being stubborn, okay? They still want to use the old British or standard units of measure, okay? So when you get your badge reports will not report in sieverts. They will report in an old unit called REM. REM is the equivalent to sievert, okay? REM's stupid. It stands stupid. It stands for radiation exposed man. Okay, REM, REM. Okay, it's the same thing as sieverts, but it's smaller. It takes 100 REM to equal 1 sievert. It's a smaller unit. And again, it's like comparing miles per hour to kilometers per hour, right? They're just different units to measure the same thing. So to convert from millirem to a unit you'll understand, like microsieverts, multiply by 10. 1 millirem equals 10 microsieverts. So if you get the unit in millirem, multiply it by 10. That'll tell you what you are in microsieverts. So you get 1 millirem on your badge report. Take that 1, multiply by 10, you got 10 microsieverts of exposure. You get 2 millirem on your badge report. Take that number 2, multiply it by 10, you got 20 microsieverts. Okay. This is only really useful for badge reports because they're stuck to measuring things in this way. Okay. By the way, the equivalent of the REM for the gray, so the REM and sievert are the same, right? REM is the old, sievert's the new. For the gray, the equivalent old unit is the RAD. RAD stands for radiation absorbed dose. And there's a 100-to-1 relationship there, 100 rads to 1 gray.
What was that radiation?
Radiation absorbed dose, the rad. The rad and the gray measure the same thing with different units. Again, kilometers per hour compared to miles per hour, right? Different units to measure the same thing. The rad and the rem are the old, what we call British or standard units of measure. All right, so those are the 3: exposure, absorbed dose, dose equivalent, and then of course the 4th one, effective dose, which I told you to just, take note of and then let it pass. There is one additional unit of measure for radioactivity. If you want to measure how many decay events are happening over time, okay? So this one's called the becquerel. Yeah, these have funny names because people got to name them, and they always put their last names to name the thing. So the becquerel is named after a person, Henri Becquerel. Defined as 1 decay event per second. So if I'm turn my Geiger counter on and it clicks 1 time every second, that is 1 becquerel of exposure. The decay rate is what? 1 becquerel. Get 100 decay events per second, we have 100 becquerels. It's a rate of exposure, not an amount. You know how like driving your car 65 miles per hour, right, is different than saying I drove 100 miles today, right? You drove your 100 miles at some speed, right? But they're different, right? This is basically the speed that you're traveling, the rate, whereas the previous units I've been telling you are the amount, total amounts, right? Let's put these everything we just did, on one slide together. So the gray for exposure, energy absorbed in air, we use the abbreviation GY. Tissue dose or absorbed dose, we also use the gray, capital G, lowercase y. The sievert, dose equivalent, tells us biologic harm, capital S, little v. The becquerel, used for radioactivity, it's giving us a rate. How many events are happening per second? Okay, so we've got our units of measure now. The gray and the sievert are the primary ones. If we talk specifically about radioactivity, alpha, beta, or gamma, we can use the becquerel. What we can do with these now is we can talk about, because what's important for the radiographer is learning about what kind of limits we have to our exposure to radiation, and maybe how those limits have changed over time. So this is moving on to a brand new section here called dose equivalent limits. Real quick before we go into this, we measure dose equivalent with what unit? Sieverts, right? And dose equivalent takes into account the amount and what else? So exposure is the amount. And what else? Not the rate, not the dose. Well, exposure and dose. Okay, so dose. And what else? To get to dose equivalent, you have to know how much you're exposed to. Exposure and dose. So how much you absorbed. Okay. And one other thing to know dose equivalent. You need to know the type of radiation. Did you say the weight? Who said it? Did you say rate or weight?
Weight?
With a W?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So the radiation weighting factor, right? Not the weight of the radiation, but the radiation weighting factor is just saying how much more harmful is this type of radiation compared to a different type. We need to know the dose and the type of radiation, okay? For X-rays, it's easy. The radiation weighting factor for X-rays is just 1, right? So the dose equals the dose equivalent, okay, for X-rays. And we are exposed to X-rays, so good. So we're going to report these units, dose equivalent limits, in units of sieverts, or millisieverts or microsieverts. We start in 1902 with a dentist, William Rollins, who says, well, I don't have a Geiger counter, right? Because Geiger didn't invent his counter for a while, okay? So we got to have a way of saying, well, I don't know. And by the way, 1902, right? This is 2 years before the first death caused by radiation. Already by that time, people had started to realize, like, if we're around a lot of this, like, this is causing skin burns and lesions and hair loss and a bunch of other bad things are happening that we can see, right? So we say, okay, this dentist goes, oh, well, let's limit our exposure to the amount that would fog a piece of photographic film over a day's time. So keep a piece of photographic film near your x-ray machine, and at the end of the day, you process the film, and if that film was kind of foggy, not unexposed, but kind of fogged over, we would go, all right, that was too much for that day. Let's kind of knock it off tomorrow. Let's get less exposure tomorrow, okay? That came out to about 100 millisieverts per day, okay? 1 sievert in x-rays all at once could cause death. So we're at about 10% of what could be fatal, okay? So it's quite a lot, right? Go to 1925, and Sievert himself recommends 10 millisieverts per week, giving us 500 millisieverts roughly per 52 weeks in a year, so it's not exactly, but roughly 500 millisieverts per year. The U.S. Advisory Committee on X-ray Protection, forms in 1931, adopts this amount 6 years later, and then 5 years after they adopt the amount, they cut it in half. Again, this is all based on empirical data. We're looking at people dying, radiologists dying early, radiologists getting early cancers and other things happening to them, and we're saying, all right, it's still too much, let's cut it back again, okay? This is now being handled at the federal level, okay? At the federal government level, they're saying, all right, here's the advice, let's come down to 5 millisieverts per week, or 250 millisieverts per year. And that stays like that for quite a while, from the 30s and on, until 1959. We have now had plenty of time to get data from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki events. We've had plenty of time to get data from all around medicine and reduce these limits further, okay? This is done by the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements, or the NCRP. They're going to become very important to us as we go through our radiation safety module, this federal level organization or council. Their recommendation is reduce to 50 millisievert per year, which is a significant reduction, right? It's 10 times less radiation than only roughly 30 years earlier. This came out to about 1 millisievert per week, 0.2 millisieverts roughly per day. Fast forward to 1991, the ICRP, which is the International Council on Radiation Protection and Measurement, recommend dropping it, but the United States NCRP says, no, we like it where it's at. So 50 millisievert per year was established in 1959 and has not changed since. This is your dose equivalent limit as a radiographer. We measure your dose equivalent limit in a couple of different ways. One of them is yearly, and this is the yearly limit. This is the one you think about most often, your yearly limit. So the current limit, 50 millisieverts per year. You must commit this one to memory. This is one that has to be remembered. Practicing radiographers average about 3 to 5 millisieverts per year of actual occupational dose. So on the high end, we get about 10% of what we're allowed. So in other words, we don't even get close to passing our yearly limit if we do things correctly. 3 to 5 millisieverts. How does that compare to the natural background? In this case, sieverts and gray can be interchanged, so don't worry about the converting units. It's less. So what's the natural background? 5 to that's the natural. So I did actually just say natural background. Sorry. What's the annual background total, including man-made and medical? About 5 to 6-ish, right? Call it 5, right? To make things simple, right? Roughly 5 millisieverts, milligray per year is the annual background total, roughly. And the average radiographer on the high end gets about that, okay? So the radiographer, on average, compared to a person who doesn't work around radiation, gets about twice as much radiation compared to the average person, right? We get about as much working as we would if we weren't working. So we get about twice as much, okay, as the average person. Still small, right? And that's the average, okay? Limited technicians, such as yourselves, will be measuring nearly nothing on your badge reports, okay? The reason for that is because when we make our exposures, we're standing behind a control panel, in a control booth, behind a leaded wall and a lead glass window, okay? And a significant distance away from our equipment, right? And our cardinal rules of radiation safety are time, distance, shielding, right? We are maximizing our distance, maximizing our shielding, and minimizing our time around radiation, okay? Time, distance, and shielding. We are doing everything we can to limit our exposure to radiation, and so the average X-ray technician who doesn't spend time in the room with the X-ray tube on will be less than this, okay? But there you are. 3 to 5 millisieverts is on average what a radiographer receives in a year. Some get more, some get less. X-ray technicians usually get significantly less. Okay, so we're going to call this your yearly dose equivalent limit, or DEL. The yearly is the most important one, at least over short terms, right? There are a total of 3 dose equivalent limits to remember. The yearly is one of them. I'm going to cover these 3 right about now. Okay, so our 3 types of dose equivalent limits, which we'll get numbers for here in just a moment, include the cumulative lifetime limit, or CLDEL, cumulative lifetime dose equivalent limit. Number 2, the prospective limit. That's the one we were just talking about. And number 3, the retrospective limit. We have 3 to learn. Okay, let's take a look at these 3, starting with the first one, cumulative lifetime limit, often just referred to as your lifetime dose. So take your age in years, multiply by 10 millisieverts. That's 10 millisieverts times your age in years. The day you start, if you use no other limits, if you ignore the yearly or the quarterly limit, so if I started, I'm 33, if I became a radiographer today, right, my first day on the job, in my first year, I'd be allowed 330 millisieverts of exposure. And I wouldn't go over any limits, okay? I can go up to that. So this is not good over short terms. This only really works to make sure that as a career, you don't go over this, okay, to keep your lifetime dose low. The CLDEL is designed for long-term control. It does not protect young workers because hypothetically an 18-year-old could get, they're using REM here, so 18 REM in their first year of radiation exposure, radiation occupation. In other words, this one works for long term. You've been a radiographer for 20 years, right? We can see that whatever your limit has built up to, we just want to make sure you haven't exceeded that. Yeah, please go. It's okay. Go on around. Yeah, you're fine. Okay. So cumulative lifetime limit. It's your age in years times 10, and the unit comes out in millisieverts. This is an important one because it can't be exceeded and allow you to continue to work up to that limit. If exceeded, corrective action is required, limiting further dose to up to 10 millisieverts per year until the dose equivalent is lower, until you're lower, until you have some wiggle room, in other words. Remember, the average radiographer gets 3 to 5 millisieverts per year, right? So you're starting off with an allowance, in other words. You're starting off with a credit of a bunch of millisieverts depending on how old you are, right? If we don't monitor you in any other way, in your first few years, you can get a lot of radiation, in principle, without us doing anything about it, okay? So this one's not great for the short term. This is good for your long term. You spend 30 years in a career, this is good to just make sure your long-term dose stays low. In other words, your average dose over a long career. For short terms, like yearly, and we'll learn in a moment quarterly, we have the prospective limit, 50 millisievert per year. This is the one that you learned a few slides ago. It can be averaged over time, but it comes out to roughly a millisievert per week.
Thank you.
You're welcome. This is useful, again, over short periods of time. Designed to restrict dose at early ages and allow some flexibility at older ages. These first two are the only ones that a radiographer needs to remember, okay? There's three. We're going to learn another one in a second, but these first two are the only ones important to radiographers. We want to care about your lifetime limit and your yearly limit. As long as you stay under both of those, you'll be fine. No one has to take any corrective action as long as you stay under both of those. If you begin to exceed one of them, you exceed your lifetime limit, or you begin to exceed your yearly limit, we have to take corrective action so that, like, moving forward, you're not exceeding either of them. Both of these are important. The yearly limit takes care of you over short time frames. The lifetime limit takes care of you over your entire career. The third and last one, retrospective. This is used primarily for nuclear power plant workers because they receive larger amounts of radiation over shorter periods of time. So we want to keep track of them over shorter periods of time. Okay, and this will ensure, because all three of these, you don't get to choose which one you want to use, right? You have to follow all three of these. Okay, so this one just ensures that all 50 millisieverts that you're allowed for the year aren't received all at one time in one short period of time, right? So you have to stay below 30 millisieverts per quarter. You also have to stay below 50 millisieverts per year. And you have to stay below your lifetime limit of whatever your age is in years times 10. All of these have to be met. You can't. There's no way you're going to get anywhere close to 30 millisieverts per quarter, which is why this one's not important for radiographers. You'd have to be using yourself as a shield for the patient, right, in order to get anywhere close to this much radiation. Okay, so this limit specifically is not used in radiography. It's still like there. It's in the background. It's a law. We still follow it, but we don't have to worry about it, in other words. And you won't be tested on the retrospective limit. Okay. They provide an important reminder, though, that radiation exposure should be more or less evenly distributed over time. They blah, blah, they give some scenarios that we're not even going to worry about. But the point is, I think in yellow here is an important point. Radiation should be evenly distributed as much as possible over time, right? If I gave you the opportunity to get all of the radiation you'll ever receive in your life today and get no more for the rest of your life, or spread it out over the rest of your life, which one would you choose? Why? Because I don't want to have it all right now, right? That's the idea, okay? Spreading it out over time makes it less effective, right? Good. Okay. So yeah, there's silly examples, but I think that's a easily understandable thing, right? If you could take it all right now, you wouldn't want to do that, right? Because that would hurt you pretty bad right now, right? But if you take all of it, spread it out over the rest of your life, then you're fine, okay? Or in other words, there's less effect. Okay, so radiation dose should be more or less distributed over time. That, by the way, is called protraction, protracting radiation, spreading it out over long periods of time. We'll revisit that word, that idea, protraction, later on in an upcoming safety module. Okay. I want to now touch on fetal exposure. Okay. So, you're a radiographer, and some of you are females, and some of you are in that reproductive age range, and you're absolutely, welcome and loud and encouraged to do whatever you want, right? So there's lots of pregnant radiographers. Okay. However, the fetus, embryo fetus, whatever stage we're talking about, is at all times more susceptible to harm from radiation than a grown-up human is, okay? So we have to take extra precautions when it comes to pregnant radiographers, all right? For one, as a radiographer or student, X-ray tech student, we can't call you pregnant until you tell us you're pregnant. We can't ask you, okay? And you can tell us yes, or you have to say yes, or I'm pregnant. No, I'm not pregnant. In other words, you have to declare pregnancy. Okay. No one can ask how or why or when. You just declare it and you put it in writing. Okay. However, when you declare yourself pregnant, we now are going to treat you a little differently. Okay. We're going to give you an additional radiation badge. So let's talk about this with a different limit. Okay. So you get an additional badge with a different limit. This limit is 0.5 millisievert per month. Notice now we're tracking you per month, right? Not per year or per quarter. We're keeping a closer eye on radiation dose with this separate radiation badge. This is an occupational limit for pregnant radiation workers. This does not apply to patients. There is no limit to the use of radiation on a patient who's pregnant. It's completely up to the discretion of the physician. So you're going to x-ray pregnant people, okay? And you're going to treat them a little bit differently, okay, when you have to. You shield them extra. You make sure you use the lowest radiation dose possible. You minimize your repeats. In other words, you practice ALARA, practice using as low as reasonably achievable, right? But you'll x-ray pregnant people. It's not infrequent. Pregnant people get hurt too, right? And the physician has to decide, because now the risk of doing the x-ray has gone up, right? So the benefit now has to be higher. Risk benefit has to weigh out, right? If the risk is very high and the benefit's very low, then we're not going to do it. Ooh. Yes, please. Thank you. We'll talk about this in a minute here. I'll put it really close to you. It's radioactive. Okay. All right, well, we're going to talk about that uranium in a minute. Good. So, there we go. That's our embryo limit. We get this by measuring the dose level taken from a second radiation monitor worn at the waist level by the worker. So, second monitor worn at waist level.
Now, are you talking about patient and technician?
No, this does not apply to patients.
So this is if I'm pregnant and a technician.
Mm-hmm. Yes. If you are a worker who has declared themselves pregnant, Now, you can be pregnant and not declare yourself pregnant and be treated the same as everyone else, okay? But once you declare yourself pregnant, the employer is required to, because of the NCRP regulations, to follow these rules, okay? Give you a second monitor, and they're also required to provide, what do they say? In any case, there's a complicated way of saying they should allow you to do work that is not directly in the radiation areas, right? So if you're MA X-ray, they should allow you to switch out of X-ray if you want to, okay? But they have to provide you with the second badge. Okay. Good, so that's the pregnancy one. There are others too. There are, let's look here. Yeah, let's use this, right? There are some emergency things and student things. So students under 18, if a high school wants to participate in a physics laboratory at some college or something like that, there's a limit for students under 18. It's 1 millisievert per year. You notice ours is 50, right? So it's 50 times less for a student under 18. There's the emergency allowance. This is for typically firefighters, police, military, your first responders, right? The lifetime allowance, they allow you a half of a sievert all at once if you have to go in and save someone from some, I don't know, power plant blows up or something. If you surpass that as a first responder, you are never allowed to respond to a radiation emergency again. Okay, you're allowed one event per lifetime. The general public, we're shooting for, on average, less than 1 millisievert per year for the general public. That's not required to be stuck to. Okay. Great. So I think that's everything I want to say for this section. I've got a little bit of time now to continue on and talk about, I might actually get through most of what I want to today. Hot dog. All right, so now we want to talk about that's on recording too.